in the production of both impact evaluations and systematic reviews over the last decade. And so we know, for example, from the 3IE databases that we have over 4,000 impact evaluations and over 350 systematic reviews. But then, so really this is kind of the, this was the origin of the evidence gap maps. So how can we make sure that impact evaluations and systematic reviews are available and used? So we know that, so Jen, I'm trying to change slides here, but I can't actually do that. Yep, okay. So we know that a lot of research is produced, but not always used. So this is so there was a study done by the World Bank a few years ago, which where they were looking at their own reports to look at downloads and citations as proxies for use, and they found that actually a third of the reports, so a third of the reports of research that they had published had never been downloaded. So that means that no one had accessed these publications in any way, and only 40% of the publications had been downloaded more than 100 times, and 87% of the reports had never been cited. So I think this is an example of the challenge that we're facing in terms of making sure that the evidence and research that is being produced is actually used in the way that that it's intended. So really, so this is the kind of the background to the evidence gap maps, to try and make research more easily available to encourage use. So what are evidence gap maps? In short, they are thematic collections of evidence focused on a particular sector or a subtopic. So the 3IE evidence gap maps focus on evidence on effects. So that means impact evaluations of interventions and systematic reviews focusing on the effects of interventions. And the evidence gap maps are structured around a framework of interventions and outcomes, and you can see an example of that on the screen. And so we have the outcomes going along at the top, so and we structure the outcomes according to the causal chain. So we start with the intermediate outcomes and move the further along you move, the outcomes are kind of further along in the causal chain, and then we have the interventions coming listed down on the side. And so we present the evidence gap maps on this our platform, and the bubbles that you can see in this framework represent studies, and so the size of the bubble indicates the size of the evidence base, and the colors of the bubbles indicates the type of studies. So the gray bubbles are primary studies, so impact evaluations, and the colored bubbles are systematic reviews. And the colors of the bubbles for the systematic reviews indicate the confidence that we have in the findings of the reviews based on our appraisal of the methods used to conduct the review. So red indicates low confidence, orange is medium confidence, and green is high confidence, and blue is protocols. And so on the slide you can see that when you hover over a bubble you get a pop-up with links to summaries of the either the systematic review or the impact evaluations on the 3IE database. And so on this platform you can also you can interact with the evidence, and so you can filter according to country or region, study designs. And you can also use there's a toggling function, so if you only want to see primary studies, you can do that. If you only want to see high quality systematic reviews, for example, you can do that. So we promote evidence gap maps to as a tool to address two main objectives. So one is to help ensure that we fund research that matters. So we know that whilst there's been an increase in funding for impact evaluations and systematic reviews, we know that the resources are limited, and so we want to make sure that we use those resources to fund important evidence gaps. And so the evidence gap maps help us do that by highlighting areas where there are few primary studies. So this is an example of an evidence gap map on productive safety nets, the 3IE conducted. So you can see for unconditional cash transfers, in-kind social transfers, and conditional cash transfers implemented as a productive safety net tool. We did not find a lot of studies. And similarly for insurance, the evidence gap map found few studies looking at this intervention type. So this is an example of how the evidence gap map can be used to highlight what we call absolute gaps in the evidence. So areas where there are few primary studies. And so the implication then is, if this is a gap that's important, then we need to focus on conducting more or funding more primary studies. The other way that the evidence gap map can be used to inform decisions about where to do or fund research is to highlight where there is potential for evidence synthesis. So in the same example again, we see, so I think the presentation may be a bit stuck, so I'm trying, but okay, so you can see from, yeah, there it is. So for multi-component interventions and also for consumption outcomes, we see that there are several cells where the grey bubble is fairly large, but there are no green bubbles. So that means that there are areas where there are quite a lot of primary studies, but no high-quality systematic review. So that indicates that there might be a synthesis gap where it might make sense to do a systematic review. So in this way, we can, before we do a systematic review and invest the resources in those, we can get an idea as to whether it's worth doing that. And then the second way that evidence gap maps can be used is to support the use of evidence to inform policy making or decision making. So we know that policy processes move quickly, and there isn't always enough time to wait for new impact evaluations or systematic reviews to be completed. So the benefit with evidence gap maps is that they can be conducted relatively quickly. And so whilst they don't replace new impact evaluations or systematic reviews, when there is a pressure on time, they can help ensure that decision makers have access to the best existing available evidence when they need it. And so as you can see from the screen, the evidence gap map provides summaries, access to summaries, user-friendly summaries about, from systematic reviews, together with the appraisal of the quality of the review. And so this is really the, I guess we suggest that if the evidence gap maps are being used to in this kind of second way of informing decision making, we suggest that users should primarily draw on the systematic reviews and focus on the high quality systematic reviews. So in this way, the evidence gap maps provide a descriptive summary of relevant evidence, and this these summaries can then be used to inform policy briefs, or in the case of a project that we're currently working on, identifying these systematic reviews will help to feed into WHO guidelines development processes. But I guess the point that's worth making is that the evidence gap maps only provide access to these summaries of systematic reviews. There isn't any further knowledge translation, but they can feed into those kind of products. And then I think it's worth highlighting where evidence gap maps sit in terms of other review and synthesis products. So I think our experience, which I'll come back to a bit later, is that people like the evidence gap maps because they're nice and visual, but I think sometimes the expectation is that they provide the type of synthesis maybe you see in a systematic review, for example. So this figure is meant to kind of, it's grouping a range of different types of approaches to evidence mapping and synthesis. And the point being that there are kind of two main types of approaches to reviewing evidence. So you have mapping approaches and you have synthesis approaches. And the goals of most maps are to describe the characteristics of existing evidence, so in terms of the methods and substantive scope of existing studies, and often also to make collections of studies more easily accessible. But there is no formal synthesis of findings. And synthesis are similar in that they systematically review the available evidence, but in contrast to maps, they also provide a more analytical synthesis of findings of individual studies, and provide kind of more substantive conclusions based on the existing evidence. And so those are the kind of the two main differences between maps and synthesis. And really what kind of what these approaches have in common is that they're based on systematic approaches to identifying and reviewing the evidence. So moving on then to the different ways in which 3IE has been working with our stakeholders and to produce evidence gap maps. So I think to date we've done this in three main ways. So the first one is that we produce evidence gap maps on demand. So for example, at the moment we're working on an evidence gap map which is funded by USAID through NORC, and this is an evidence gap map on state-society relations, where the request for the map is coming from USAID in terms of the substantive scope of the map, but 3IE is responsible for producing the map. We're still engaging closely with USAID and also a broader range of other stakeholders with either an interest or expertise on the topic. But in terms of the doing, it's 3IE who's responsible for that. A second model is co-production of evidence gap maps. So this is I guess the only example we have of doing this, but I think it's a interesting approach, which is so far working out very well. So we're working with WHO in producing an evidence gap map together. So they had an interest in having an evidence gap map on reproductive, maternal, newborn and child health. So they approached us to work with them on that. So in this case, WHO is providing some funding and for some of 3IE's work, and so we have a team that's made up of a combination of 3IE staff and WHO staff, and we're working on the evidence gap map together. In this case, so we've just come back from Geneva, where we've had a meeting with WHO colleagues, but also a broad range of other stakeholders interested in the topics, both implementing agencies, academic experts, and funders. And then the final model, which I guess is where we have less intense involvement, or it's more of a kind of light touch collaboration, is where we primarily provide training and technical support. So an example of that is a evidence map that was conducted by DPME in South Africa. So in this case, we were involved in providing training. So I went to Pretoria and we had a workshop for a couple of days, and we provided some technical support in form of comments on the protocol. But the map is being produced by DPME in collaboration with a team of researchers that they've hired directly. So I think from these kind of different experiences that we've had in being involved in producing evidence gap maps with stakeholders, there are, I think, a number of lessons that I think might be useful if you're thinking of doing an evidence gap map or commissioning one. So I think one key lesson is the importance of building on existing frameworks, if such frameworks exist. So often, a key part of developing the evidence gap map is to start with developing this framework. So what makes up the framework for the matrix. And so that involves defining the key interventions and outcomes that form the substantive scope of the evidence gap map. And so often there will be existing terminology or intervention typologies that exist either in the academic literature or the policy literature. And so I think as far as possible, it's useful to build on those existing frameworks, because it helps ensure that the evidence gap map resonates with a broader range of stakeholders. And I think also another lesson which I think is, I guess, particularly important when thinking about trying to ensure that an evidence gap map, even if it emerges from a internal institutional demand, to try to ensure that the evidence gap map has some value beyond any single agency's interest, to engage with a broad range of stakeholders. And so typically we do that through workshops, and sometimes we do surveys to make sure that we cover the types of interventions and outcomes that are being considered relevant by people who are involved in a particular, either implementing or studying in a particular area. And then I think also another key lesson is that it's important to manage expectations both internally and externally, and to be clear about what evidence gap maps can and can't do. I think that often people get a bit excited by they like the visuals of the map, but to be clear about what the maps are actually doing. So they are primarily, they're a tool for capturing and transferring existing evidence relatively quickly, but there is quite limited knowledge translation, and so if that is a goal of the project, it might be a good idea to also consider additional derivative products that can draw on the map. So I think in the case of this project that we're doing with WHO, the evidence gap map will feed into guidelines development, where actually the findings of reviews are actually translated by experts. And finally, it's important to have a balance. So however the evidence gap map is conducted and whoever is doing it, it's important to ensure that there is a balance within the team of people with substantive expertise. So that can be either from policy or implementation involvement or research background, and to have a balance with methods expertise. And I think our experience is that results in more efficient production, but also a higher quality of the final output. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Birte. Today I want to talk about how the IRC has adapted the evidence map format to fit our needs as an organization, while simultaneously using them as a tool to help us better institutionalize the use of evidence in our work. Now, as a quick reminder, if you have any questions during the presentation, please do type them into the chat. We are continuing to monitor the questions, and it's just nice to put them in there, and we'll answer them to the best of our ability. Now, just to quickly set the tone for this discussion, these are a set of adaptations meant to customize the evidence maps to our unique needs as an organization. And we went down a very specific path to get to this point. The path that you go down, if you decide to adapt the maps, will look very different depending on your needs. So please think of this as just one example of many ways of doing this. Now let's just start by situating the evidence maps within our the IRC's larger organizational strategy, which launched in 2015, and because it's a 5-year strategy, is called IRC 2020. The evidence maps are only a part of a part of a part of this strategy, and they fit in with the other parts in interesting ways. Now you can see that as part of the strategy, we've clearly defined the ultimate goals, which are meaningful improvements in people's health, safety, education, economic well-being, and power, all while narrowing the gender gap across these outcomes. All aspects of our strategy are built around achieving these goals. To achieve the outcomes and make our programs more impactful, the IRC 2020 strategy identifies 6 strategic objectives, each of which has a very specific role to play in improving our ability to impact our end goals. These include efforts to be more cost efficient, to increase our scale and reach, to increase the speed and timeliness of our programs, to improve the responsiveness to beneficiary needs, and to improve our ability to innovate. One of these 6 strategic objectives explicitly refers to effectiveness. The effectiveness initiatives, of which there are many, focus primarily on ensuring that we're designing and choosing programs and interventions that work and work well. These initiatives include things like tools for diagnosing underlying problems, adapting programs to context, measuring progress against outcomes and course-correcting them as needed. But it also includes what's called the Outcomes and Evidence Framework, which in short focuses on ensuring that our programs are outcomes-driven, so that they directly work towards a specific end goal as opposed to us just doing whatever we get funding to do, and also ensuring that they're evidence-based. So ensuring that we use evidence to guide our decision-making regarding what works best in a given situation. But this is a long process, and we're only 2 years in. Now, what we're all attempting to do is groundbreaking and exciting, but it's also complicated, and yes, it is a bit messy. But in the end, we do believe that it will lead to more effective programming, more effective processes for program design, and more effective thinking about program design. So we spent 2015 developing, testing, and refining the tools needed to support the end goal of being outcomes-driven and evidence-based. During this time, we built things like the original prototype evidence maps, as well as other tools. In 2016, we spent it trying to roll out the prototypes of these tools. And we'll be doing some major course corrections on these as part of our findings from 2016 during the upcoming year. But we do believe at this time that we've learned a lot that may be helpful to you. Now, with all that said, within this larger organizational strategy, where do these evidence maps actually fit in the picture? When we first built this initiative, we were a little optimistic about what we'd be able to do with the research evidence. Like Birte mentioned, it's important to manage expectations, but at first we were very optimistic. Right here is my favorite example of the original Optimism we had, which is an early evidence strength scale, which we've since moved away from. Basically, we wanted to be able to say, for every single intervention that we were considering doing in a context, we wanted to be able to say how evidence-based that intervention was on a scale of 0 to 6. So if you're deciding between, say, cash transfers and a voucher program for a given context, you could pull up the evidence and say, oh, this option's rated an evidence strength 5, and this one's a 2, and the first one's got a bigger effect size, and their decision made. And interventions rated 0, we'd stop doing, and 1 through 3, we'd invest in doing more research on them, and then everything 4 and above, we'd just scale up as much as possible. And that would be amazing if it were so simple. But in reality, it's of course more complicated. This optimism came from the point that we built this initial framework almost entirely around a researcher's understanding of what evidence-based is and means. And this perspective overlooks a lot of underlying implementation and strategic issues. We defined evidence-based almost entirely around the existence and application of relevant systematic reviews and impact evaluations. And this mental framework informed all of our initial decisions. So for example, if your definition of evidence-based is this, what's the first step you take? You start by collecting impact evaluations and systematic reviews so that you can actually start figuring out what counts as evidence level 1 versus 4 versus 6 and so on, which is why we decided to borrow the evidence map format. That's what it does. It collects the impact evaluations and systematic reviews and makes them more accessible. And it does this very, very well. Now, from the start, we knew that this would be difficult, but it wasn't until we actually began building the maps and trying to use them that we really developed an understanding about why and how this initial approach was fundamentally misguided. We were falling into a common trap in evidence-based decision-making. Basically, there's this belief, especially among academic types, that research evidence is the best source of objective truth about what works and what does not work. And people do want this truth so that they can make good decisions. But it's just so hard to understand these research articles. So the idea is that we should just make the truth easier to find and read, and then all of a sudden, people are making good decisions because they're reading this truth. In this way of thinking, just making research easier to use necessarily leads to positive results. However, this oversimplifies the problem. It's not just about getting people to use the research. Now, this probably ends in news to a lot of us here, but it's really worth reiterating. Improving access to research does not tell us the full story. There are many other factors that affect how and when people look for and use evidence. And just because people are using evidence doesn't mean that they're doing it completely correctly or meaningfully. And efforts to make the research easier to use sometimes makes this problem worse, because a lot of the efforts focus on oversimplifying the results in a way that a lot of the underlying information that's actually important for decision making is lost. Research briefs for policymakers often produce statements that seem like simple objective truths, like cash transfers positively impact income. But oftentimes there's also all of these hidden important caveats that actually are important for decision making. Like cash transfers impact income for certain people when certain contextual factors are present and only when implemented in this specific way. Or the research might be asking the wrong question, or it might have a lot of uncertainty, etc. Overall, there's a lot of factors that make it so that the whole make research evidence easier to use and interpret approach, it just doesn't get us all of the way there. Now, making research results easier to find and interpret is still a great starting point, of course. And the evidence map format is very good at making research results easier to find and interpret. But in between the evidence maps and other efforts to make research evidence easier to use, between these efforts and the end goal of meaningful positive changes in decision making is this incredibly complicated mess of other processes and products and such that help turn the evidence in the evidence maps and other products into meaningful decisions. Don't let the point that it's only a single box in this flowchart belie the complexity of this aspect. It's a huge and crazy mess of processes and incentives and so on. And all of us here know this, right? And we at IRC, we knew this. We knew that all of this was there ahead of time. But we were over-optimistic about how much we could sidestep it, get around it. But luckily, in the process of actually building the maps and trying to use them, it has been instrumental in figuring out how we can actually approach this crazy mess of processes, systems, and incentives in a meaningful way. And so we quickly realized that it was very important to work with these systems, figuring out how we could adapt the evidence maps to fit the needs of the systems, the existing systems, as opposed to trying to adapt these systems to fit a rigid understanding of what evidence-based is. We needed to work with them. And when you start doing this, something magical can happen. If you use your existing systems to inform the development of a tool, like the evidence maps, you can make a stronger tool. But as you start using the tool to help solve problems in your systems, you can use what you learn and the solutions you build to help improve the system as well. And when the system improves, new problems arise which may require you to change the tool. And it can go back and forth. Now, the most important point to take away from this slide is this. It is impossible to adapt the evidence maps to your specific needs correctly on the first try. Every time you make an adaptation, it will reveal new problems. And every time you react to these problems, you will reveal new opportunities. If you budget for a single development stage, you're probably not going to end up with an ideal product. It takes time. For example, our evidence maps have been constantly changing working prototypes for over 2.5 years at this point. and we're continuing to develop and adapt them and our larger systems, and we'll continue to do this for at least another 2.5 years. Now, I'm sure by now all of you are super interested in seeing what on earth could be so different about these maps that it took us 2.5 years to test and build, and it's not even out of the prototype stage yet. So let's take a look. Right now, the DRCs maps are working prototypes that are housed in an Excel spreadsheet. So we added some advanced filtering features too. It's worth noting that DFID is also using Excel to build and adapt their evidence maps as well. So while it does seem like a low-tech solution, we, as well as DFID, have found that it can serve as a very powerful way to build and adapt and explore this format, especially when you're doing rapid prototyping. Now back to the original point. For the most part, they're very similar to other maps that 3IE, as well as other organizations, have built and used. Interventions are rows, outcomes are columns, evidence of impact appears at the intersections. You can zoom in on any given part to learn more, or you can use the filter button in the upper left-hand corner to create a custom view of interventions and/or outcomes that you're interested in. So far, so good. It's basically the same as other maps. But this is where we really start diverging. When you go to an IRC map and you find a piece of research investigating the impact of X on Y that particularly interests you, you simply select it, click Control-T, and you are taken to a row in what's called the Bibliography tab, which tells you in one place everything you need to know about the conclusion of that study. Now, being able to find this additional information was a major request from our staff. While they kept asking for simpler portrayals of research, so simplified views, they also always wanted to have this option of digging deeper. And this gives them that opportunity. So what sort of information was demanded? The first and most important piece of information you find is contextual information about that conclusion. When we originally showed the maps to our staff and asked how we could make this information more actionable, the #1 response was context. Now, a lot of the most common evidence of impact isn't immediately applicable to us as a humanitarian organization, since it comes from stable development contexts. So we need to, and all of us need to, adapt evidence with an eye to the role of context. An impact evaluation in the stable development context might not apply in the first 3 months of a humanitarian emergency, in a refugee or IDP camp, or in a conflict-affected setting, and so on. And even an evaluation in one stable context might not apply in a different stable context. And to be able to make these determinations, to decide if the evidence applies, we need to be able to see what context the research is actually investigating, especially since it's not always made readily apparent in these studies, or it may be hard to find. And so, with that in mind, we went through and pulled out every single piece of contextual information that our staff said was important, and it added it to this bibliography tab that I showed you previously. It's not just context that's important, though, which brings me to my second point. We also need to be specific about what research actually measures when making a conclusion. Now, I've often heard fans of systematic reviews state that you can compare apples and oranges if you're investigating fruit. And I agree with this statement. But if you're investigating fruit and you're making conclusions about fruit, just please tell us what fruit you used in your analysis. If a review is investigating different measures for a single topic, an apple measure and an orange measure, we separate that out in the maps so that you can get the precise conclusion that you are looking for without ever opening a full article. That way you never need to worry whether we misapplied a given conclusion. If you see that we marked that some intervention had an impact on the fruit outcome in our map, and you're dubious about that, you can see how that given study measured the fruit outcome. Did they use the apple measure or the orange measure? Now this is hugely important because it's important to be specific. It's important also to synthesize to find those abstractions and commonalities, but this should not come at the expense of specificity. Now to bring it back to real examples, if I'm working in education, in the education sector, and I see that an intervention has an impact on, quote, education outcomes, I want to know what those outcomes actually are. If they're all about enrollment, and enrollment isn't a problem in my context, that's important to know. If a review says that something has an impact on learning outcomes, I want to know what they're talking about. Does that apply to literacy scores, as well as language skills, as well as grade progression? These nuances are important because the problems that we seek to address are nuanced. Now, just to summarize everything before we get to conclusions, get to questions, there's 4 main takeaways that I really want to stress from this presentation. And the first is that, yes, it is possible to adapt the evidence maps, but it takes time and it takes multiple attempts. There's nothing wrong with using Excel to do this. It can be a hugely powerful platform for experimenting. Now, in terms of how we ended up adapting the maps, it primarily took the form of adding nuanced details about context and outcomes. But it may be different for you. Third, it's important to note that evidence maps can help you pressure test your assumptions about what evidence-based decision-making looks like, but this requires a willingness to be wrong. There have been many examples of this in the IRC, but the one that I really want to stress is that it wasn't until we really began using these maps that we realized that this initial approach of directly categorizing interventions by evidence strength was just not feasible in our context. And it taught us to be more flexible and helped us explore other options. And with that, I just want to say thank you, everyone, and I will open it up to any questions that anyone has.
Okay, this is Jen again, and thank you, Rick, and thank you, Birte, for your presentations. Please, to anyone who has questions, please go ahead and put them in the question box or the chat box. I did receive one question in the queue, and the question was if it was directed to Birte, but it could be interesting to hear Rick's answer as well about, what are some examples of people, like if somebody going in and using an evidence gap map or a gap map, and about how long does it take for somebody to use it? And maybe if you can give a couple examples of, just different purposes for use in that way.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep. So I think the clearest example of use is that, so 3IE, we are now increasingly using, so for all our thematic windows, so when we fund primary research, we use the evidence gap maps to inform where we focus that primary research, and I guess and this often includes thematic windows where we are working with partners, including DFID, for example, and there is a substantive focus for the map, for the window, and the evidence gap map indicates where there is a lack of primary studies, and then the thematic window is then focused on closing the gaps that are considered of high priority. Another example is where we're working with the Children's Investment Fund Foundation on doing some work on land use change and forestry, and so as part of that work we've done an evidence gap map, and we have identified areas where there are quite a lot of impact evaluations but no recent high quality systematic review, and so in this case we will be commissioning a systematic review on the back of that. And I guess so this is ongoing work, but the work that I think that really primarily the use that we are aware of so far is primarily to inform decisions about research, where to invest in research. But I guess in terms of this supporting the use of evidence to inform decisions, this project that we're currently working on with WHO, where by identifying and making high quality systematic reviews available, those will then feed into to planned guidelines, where, so I'm not sure how familiar you are with guidelines development processes, but they typically rely on high quality systematic reviews. So the evidence gap map will help identify the reviews that exist currently for that.
And for IRC, so we've been portraying the evidence maps internally as a resource for quickly finding and interpreting research evidence, which makes it so that the examples of use are very diverse, because in a way it can be used for any process that benefits from the use of evidence. Right now it's primarily used by our technical staff, staff who usually do want to access high quality research evidence and use it in their day-to-day work, but often are strapped for time. This really helps them do that much quicker, so they've been using it in proposal writing, developing program guidance, so this additional translation work that needs to happen before it really leads to more decision making. It feeds into those processes. We've also been using them to develop organizational research priorities. So the IRC, in addition to being an implementing organization, also we produce a lot of impact evaluations, and we've recently tried to structure our strategy for where we invest in impact evaluations a little more systematically, and the evidence maps have been very useful for that. There's also many external users who use them. So the EPI Center, which produces a lot of systematic reviews, has been using the IRC's maps as well as 3IE's maps to decide where to invest in new systematic reviews, which is a very traditional use of an evidence map. And I've also heard word that the Center for Global Development has been using these as a way to quickly find citations and information for new reports. But the use cases are very diverse. And just as one last point, we've also used them to fill out the data for our new interactive outcomes and evidence framework, which tries to bring these research results directly to our country programs. That's a whole other product, very interesting. If you want to check it out, you can go see it for yourself at oef.rescue.org, but that's a very interesting experiment as well.
So unfortunately, we're about out of time. I was hoping to have some time to hear from some of the participants, particularly there are a few people joining from IRC about how you've all, just from a practical standpoint, use the maps as well. But yeah, unfortunately, time is a little bit short. I do want to, just let you know that our webinars are posted online. And with Rick and Birte's permission, I'll also share the slides with all of you following this. And please do use these resources or ask us, questions following if anything comes up. I know Rick, it sounds like would be happy to. I know Birte and I would be happy to answer questions about 3A membership or about the gap maps as well. So thank you all so much for joining, and hope to see you at a future webinar. All right, bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Please do send any feedback you have to us at oef@rescue.org. We always love hearing from people, no matter how positive or negative the feedback is. We do want to hear from you, so thank you.